If you were to meet someone with unshakable faith, a unshakable faith that had absolute conviction that our country was on the right track, that had absolute conviction that our children will create a better environment and economic opportunities than we inherited when we were young. An unshakable faith that people in the world overall were choosing unity over division, choosing interfaith inclusivity as opposed to religious exclusivism, choosing oneness over othering. If you met someone with such unshakable faith, would you be impressed? Yeah, I would too. Would part of you think that they were perhaps a little naive? Or perhaps they may seem a little out of touch with reality? Oh, I like that. The kids are getting in on this one too. You know, our founder said something. He said, "Our thinking doesn't change reality at all. Some people think it does, but it never flattened the world when they thought it was flat. It only flattened their experience on a round one. When someone knew it was round, he could navigate it." And as religious scientists, our denomination here, it's so important. It's almost like a sacred duty for us to hold a high consciousness for our country, to hold an optimistic viewpoint for our world, to represent oneness and unity even in the midst of division. We can get so lost. But it's also important for us to see what's real, to see what's really happening, from time to time to step back and see where we are. Kurt Vonnegut alluded to the point that if you're going the wrong direction, to step back is to take a step in the right direction. In this topic of relevant faith that we're entering into this month, it's interesting to say that an unshakable faith has an absolute conviction that God is in all circumstances working towards the highest and best in all things. Totally admirable. A shakeable faith, we might say, has room for doubt, for skepticism, perhaps even a little bit of anxiety and uncertainty. And one of the things I want to point out today is when it comes to relevant faith, it's the latter that we may need more of. That perhaps a little bit more doubt could strengthen our faith. That perhaps to be a little anxious by looking around at the world around you is understandable. To be in a time of uncertainty, perhaps it isn't best to make up a reality or manufacture something superficial, but to really look, to really listen, not only at the state of things around us, but in our own everyday lives. And I think that's the first key to a relevant faith, is to live not outside of reality, but in reality. We might also say that the second key to a relevant faith is to recognize that a relevant faith isn't something that's fixed. It's something that's fluid, that can expand and contract at different times in our lives. We might say that a certain pessimism is the opposite of an unshakable faith. But if we're not careful, I think they're just two sides of the same coin. We may know someone with unshakable faith, but how many of us know someone who's a certain pessimist? Their theme song is AC/DC's Highway to Hell, and there's a lot to burn on the way there. Right? They have absolute certainty that our institutions in the United States are broken and cannot be fixed. They have absolutely certainty that no, our kids will not inherit a cleaner environment or better economic conditions. And you know what? The little brats probably don't deserve it anyways. They have absolute faith in their pessimism, that nothing is going to work out. Artificial intelligence, take me now. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go. And we may know a certain pessimist, but I think the truth is it doesn't take much to get any of us there, even if just for a little while. You start thinking about that candidate who you don't want to win office, and you go there. Something doesn't go your way, and you go there. Traffic when you didn't expect it, and you can go there. That certain pessimism. And this idea of relevant faith, it's somewhere in between this unshakable faith and this pessimism, where we begin to take sometimes contradictory realities and bring them together. I trust absolutely that there's a divine presence in, through, and around everything. And I also trust that I better pay attention to the problems and the challenges that are facing me, my country, and the world. Because if not, I'm living in my version of reality and not in the one that life is calling me to step into with greater clarity and knowing. Richard Feynman, the great scientist, tells a story of being a young man, and he was out on a nature walk with a friend, and his friend, who was a little cocky, he said, "Hey, you see that bird over there? Do you know the name of that bird?" And young Richard answered, "I have no idea what that bird is." "Doesn't your father teach you anything?" "It's a Spencer's warbler." And Richard shares, but it was opposite. His father had taught me. "See that bird?" His father had told Richard, "It's a Spencer's warbler." "Well, in Italian, it's a chudo lapidida. In Portuguese, it's a bam da peida. In Chinese, it's a chung long ta, and in Japanese, it's a katanoke takeda. You could know the name of that bird in all the languages of the world, but when you're finished, you'll know absolutely nothing whatever about the bird. You'll only know what humans in different places and what they call the bird. So let's look at the bird and see what it's doing. That's what counts." I would say this applies to spirituality. That we can study all those 101 names of God that Patty was alluding to in her beautiful prayer and still know nothing about God. We'll know a lot about what people say about God, but we may miss it out completely if we're not willing to look directly into our lives with confidence or with doubt and open up to that deeper experience. What does it mean to stop naming your life? Good, bad, crappy, indifferent, whatever it is. What does it mean to just stop naming it and listen for what it does and what it reveals to us about what our faith actually and really is? This leads to the core of the message today, the third key to a relevant faith, which is a transformational vulnerability. The willingness to be totally present in this vast mystery called life, and to open up to see not what faith can be invented, but what kind of faith can be revealed. The most difficult day of my ministerial career was on October 12th, 2011. I was the senior minister of the Seal Beach Center for Spiritual Living in Orange County, California. I was sitting on a bench outside talking with my board president, and not 50 yards away began the gunshots that would ultimately lead to 8 people losing their lives and the greatest mass shooting in Orange County history. It was a terrible day. And you want to do everything you can to help in the light of that tragedy, and thank God the police were on the scene like that and captured the perpetrator. And our church, just for a short time, just for a couple hours, got to bring in the family members of these victims who, when there's a crime scene investigations unit on the scene, they have to do their work for hours and hours. And here are these people sitting there waiting to get the official word on what they already know, that their loved one has been viciously, terribly taken from them and from the world by a wretched act of violence of a deeply disturbed and demented human being. And you're there trying to bring water to these people. You're there wanting to be present. And to be totally authentically honest, I prayed they wouldn't ask me for prayer. Because part of prayer is to be able to acknowledge God and any instance or any circumstance. And in that moment, through my experience of that day, I saw none. And yet, my prayer, handing a bottle of water, putting a hand on the shoulder, avoiding saying things like, it's going to be okay, when in that moment it is anything but okay. But my prayer was, God, I cannot see you in this event, but please show up in our response. Please show up in how we respond to these individuals who've been so victimized this day. Please show up in the response of the police officers and the civic leaders. Please show up in the community. And that's sometimes what a transformational vulnerability is. It's showing up transparent in your life, not knowing exactly how the divine or life or whatever you call it is going to show up, but to be prepared for it, even if it only shows up through you, through how you show up for other people. And as little as I experienced the divine in that tragic event, I can say with some genuine honesty that I perhaps never experienced God so much as I did on that day when it came to how people responded. Immediate remembering of hope in the face of despair, an immediate expression of love in the midst of such tragic fear, a sense of oneness and unity when someone would behave with such little appreciation for human dignity or life itself. It was a wretched but then a beautiful experience. And sometimes, to be frank, life can be in some moments like a nightmare, shattered by grace. It can be like a nightmare that's shattered by grace. In the midst of the loss of someone we love, a devastating change to a health condition, a challenge that we see, or a tragedy that we see in the world, life can be a nightmare that gets shattered by grace, shatters of remembrance, of beauty, of love, of truth, even when we can't see it. It speaks, of course, to the famous lines of Leonard Cohen in his song Anthem, where he sings, "Ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." The danger of an unshakable faith is it doesn't always leave room for the cracks. We never have to give thanks for our wounds or what put them there, but we can give thanks for what they can offer us, the light that can shine through those wounds, the clarity and wholeness that can come from an experience of brokenness, the guide or the principle or the new self that is born as us, even in the midst of the loss of someone or something we dearly love. There is that light that can only come through when our faith is relevant enough to be true to our experience and yet true to that divine thread, that divine spirit that works within it, to come forward in an incredibly powerful way. So perhaps the next time you are experiencing an incredible doubt, maybe it's simply a sign that your faith is being reborn. Not that there's anything wrong with your faith, but that it's being called to a newfound experience of God, to a newfound experience of what you're capable of, to a newfound experience of what humanity can look like when expressed vulnerably with one another. I was having a lunch with a good friend, Joni Inman, a few weeks ago. Joni sadly lost her daughter this year, and she was sharing with me that Dr. Patty, our beloved Dr. Patty, called her one night. And what did Patty say? She could have said, and it could have been true, but she didn't say, "Everything's going to be okay. God is right there. I'm so sorry for your loss." All Patty said was, I just called to cry with you. I just called today to cry with you. What a beautiful expression to me of a transformational vulnerability. To realize that God in that moment maybe couldn't be understood, but could be best expressed by two loving people sharing tears over a phone call with one another. when we're willing to embrace transparent and transformational vulnerability, we can bring a newfound creative element to our life. If you look through our Adventure in Faith materials this week or go to our landing page, you'll see there's a worksheet there that speaks about the transformational qualities of a relevant faith. They're qualities that on the surface we may look at and see as flawed. Vulnerability, that could mean defenselessness. Surrendering, giving up. Forgetting, got to remember everything. Leaving, no, you got to stick with it. Not knowing, no, I got to know. I got to be wise and understand. And yet, if we can sometimes embrace these qualities in our lives, they have a transformative ability to bring forth what our life is calling for: to heal, to be connected, to embrace a greater prosperity and abundance. And I only have time to touch upon vulnerability today, but I ask you, where in your life are you being called to be more vulnerable? It could be, where is that space or circumstance in your life where you're most afraid to be vulnerable? It could be that place where you love most deeply and profoundly. There's an old saying that the truth will set you free, but first it will get you a punch in the nose. And sometimes being vulnerable, sharing a hurt, sharing something that's going to take some boldness or some courage to share, it's scary. And sometimes it may seem like it makes things worse with someone else before it makes things better. But that's where a relevant faith comes in. That even though the immediate consequence is negative, the overall one is merging towards that good, is veering towards greater freedom and greater understanding. Been touched reading the news reports and then watching Netflix. There's a new documentary with Will Ferrell in it called Will and Harper. And the story starts off with Will Ferrell, who's a famous movie star and was in Saturday Night Live. And he had a best friend named Andrew Steele, who was a writer, not in front of the camera, but behind the camera at SNL. And they became creative partners and did so much wonderful work together. And they disconnected a little bit during pandemic times, like so many of us did. And he received an email from Andrew, who is now named Harper. And the email explained that Harper now identified as a female. And if you could, kind of support me, she says, as well. What a courageous act of transformational vulnerability to, even in an email, which can be a superficial form of communication, to share one's heart, to share one's truth. Farrell, like many people in Harper's life, may have initially sensed a sense of betrayal. How come you didn't tell me sooner? Only to understand and ask questions to realize that Harper, her whole life, had been betraying herself to a degree and was now coming forward to embrace who she authentically was with the people that she loved. It reminds me a little bit of Carl Rogers, and I'm paraphrasing it, but he said, that thing in you that you're most afraid to share, that thing in you that you might share, that if you shared it, you might be excommunicated or made fun of or rejected, that thing in you, if you were to actually share it, would be the one thing that most resonated with and inspired other people. What an interesting principle of life, that what is most personal is most universal. And that if we can find and articulate maybe something we haven't even been able to put words to within ourselves and articulate them in the safest possible places with people we love and care about, we could grow and we could create greater healing and we could release the elephants in the room and embrace a greater harmonic space that resonates with our body, our minds, and our souls. That's the power of what a transformational vulnerability can do. So I invite you to be aware of where you might bring that greater sense of vulnerability to your life, what the area is, what the circumstance is. There's only a couple thousand people watching, but does anyone want to say where it is for them? Good, David, good. Yes, great. Great. Life's calling for it, and if we were just waiting around for God to show up, she may not arrive. But if you're willing to be a presence for the divine to show up through this skill of transformational vulnerability, you can offer something, a vitamin C for a circumstance, a understanding of someone where they've never felt that understood before, and a way of becoming who you really are in a way that your life is calling for and needing you to be. So with that, as we move into prayer this morning, I invite any of our incredible prayer practitioners to stand and join me. Know that here in this Teal Sanctuary, these incredible folks are available for an affirmative prayer in front of the stage. And let us be aware of those solid places within us that give us inspiration and life and gratitude. But let us not turn away from those places where we may experience some weakness, some woundedness, some unresolved hurt, where we may feel not in the midst of knowing, but in the darkness of not knowing what is or how something's going to turn out. And let us recognize that we meet our God in both places. We meet the divine in those areas that are strong, that have been nurtured, that help us to thrive, but also as we bring a light of grander awareness to those weak places, to those tender spots, to those places that perhaps have experienced a shattering of grace here or there. Let us know that there is wisdom and depth, a divine beauty of who we are, not in what caused those wounds or weaknesses, but in what we get to bring forth in spite of them. Knowing that the divine speaks through all things, that God speaks up itself without coercion or even invocation. If we just listen, embody, and embrace that we walk this path of life not alone, but hand in hand with the infinite. That it is friendly, that it is familiar, that it is the divine memory of all being and becoming within us, becoming something unique and fantastic as you and your life, right here and right now. And so it is.